October 11, 1969. A taxi driver named Paul Stein was shot and killed in San Francisco. That fact is widely known. It is one of the most discussed events connected to the Zodiac case. But what is rarely examined is what that night did to the investigation itself. Not emotionally, not publicly, but structurally. Before that point, the Zodiac crimes were terrifying, but they were still compartmentalized. Different crime scenes, different jurisdictions, separate reports, and separate investigative paths. The case was growing, but it was still moving through defined channels. Each event generated paperwork, evidence logs, and investigative actions that, while complex, remained contained within local structures. After October 11, 1969, that containment began to break. The crime occurred in a major city, under a different spotlight, involving different agencies and a higher level of coordination. Suddenly, information had to travel farther. Reports had to be shared across more departments. Evidence was no longer just collected. It had to be synchronized. And this is the point where the Zodiac investigation changed shape. It stopped being only a pursuit of a suspect and started becoming a problem of organization. The more attention the case received, the more agencies became involved. The more agencies became involved, the more complex the paperwork became. And the more complex the paperwork became, the harder it was to maintain a clear center of control. The investigation expanded outward, but the file began to stretch thin. More evidence did not necessarily bring clarity. More tips did not necessarily bring direction. Instead, the volume of material began to grow faster than the administrative structure designed to manage it. And when a case grows faster than its structure, the risk is not only that the suspect remains unidentified. The risk is that the record itself begins to lose coherence. Investigations rely on action, interviews, warrants, follow-ups, decisions. But case files rely on order, classification, routing, responsibility, documentation. After October 1969, the Zodiac investigation continued to move in the field, but inside the paperwork, the structure was beginning to strain. This moment marks a quiet turning point, not because the killer disappeared, not because evidence suddenly stopped, but because from here on, the challenge was no longer only about solving a crime. It was about managing a case that was becoming larger than the system built to hold it. And that administrative strain is where the long-term paralysis of the Zodiac file truly begins. After October 1969, the Zodiac case no longer belonged neatly to a limited set of local investigations. It began to spread across jurisdictions, departments, and administrative systems, each with its own procedures, reporting styles, and internal priorities. On the surface, this looked like progress: more personnel, more resources, more attention focused on the same case. But administratively, it introduced a different kind of problem, one that is rarely visible from the outside. There was no longer a single, clearly defined center responsible for maintaining the coherence of the entire file. Each agency continued to produce reports. Each department stored evidence according to its own structure. Each investigative unit followed leads based on the information immediately available to them. But as information moved between systems, the case file stopped behaving like a single, continuous record. It became a collection of segments. A report written in one place might not be fully integrated elsewhere. A lead developed by one unit might not be tracked with the same priority by another. Responsibility did not disappear, but it became divided into smaller and smaller portions. And divided responsibility, over time, leads to divided records. The problem was not a lack of effort. The problem was the absence of a unified structure that ensured every piece of information returned to a common center. In complex investigations, evidence alone does not create direction. Direction comes from synthesis, from someone, somewhere, having the authority and the overview necessary to connect separate strands into a single narrative. When that synthesis weakens, the file begins to reflect fragmentation instead of coordination. Documents still exist, reports are still written, evidence is still logged, but the relationships between those elements begin to thin. This does not cause an immediate breakdown. There is no moment where the system announces that the file has become disjointed. Instead, it happens gradually. The file grows thicker, but the overall picture becomes harder to see. Information increases, but shared understanding decreases. Activity continues, but alignment fades. And in a criminal case, once alignment weakens, the ability to move toward a decisive legal step weakens with it. The investigation may still be active in parts, but the file, the structure meant to hold everything together, is already beginning to pull apart. And when a file begins to lose its center, the long-term consequences are rarely immediate. They unfold slowly, through gaps, delays, and decisions that never quite come together. That is how an expanding investigation can quietly become an administratively unstable one, even while it still appears from the outside to be moving forward. When a criminal case file no longer has a clear center of control, the first thing that begins to fade is not evidence. It is the ability to make unified decisions. In any serious investigation, major legal steps depend on consolidation. Someone has to review the totality of the material. Someone has to determine whether the threshold for a formal move has been reached. Someone has to be responsible for saying, "This is where the case stands." But when a file becomes distributed across multiple agencies and systems, that responsibility becomes harder to define. One department may hold physical evidence. Another may store reports. A separate unit may manage leads or communications. Each piece still exists, but the authority to assemble all of it into a single, actionable position becomes increasingly unclear. Legal decisions cannot be made in fragments. A prosecution cannot move forward based on isolated portions of a file. A formal conclusion cannot emerge from pieces that were never fully integrated into a single structure. So instead of moving toward a decision, the case begins to circle within its own material. Work continues in places. Information is reviewed from time to time. But the file no longer supports the kind of coordinated assessment required for a decisive legal step. And without decisive steps, a case does not close. It drifts. There is no dramatic announcement, no formal declaration that the system has reached its limit. Instead, there is an increasing gap between the existence of information and the existence of action. The investigation may still be referenced, the case name may still appear in records, but the structural pathway that leads from evidence to legal resolution grows weaker. This is how a case can remain officially open while functionally stalled. Not because there is nothing left to examine, but because the file no longer provides a stable platform from which a legal decision can safely be made. Over time, hesitation replaces momentum. Review replaces direction. Possibility replaces procedure. And as that pattern repeats, the absence of decisions becomes its own defining feature. The case does not end, but it also does not move forward in any meaningful legal sense. It occupies a space between investigation and resolution, a space sustained not by active progress, but by the inability of the fragmented file to support a unified conclusion. That is the stage where long-term administrative paralysis begins to take hold. When a case reaches a point where the file can no longer support clear legal movement, the system does not always respond with a formal ending. There is not always a statement that the investigation has failed. There is not always a declaration that the case is closed. Sometimes, the system responds in a quieter way. It becomes silent. This silence is not written as a conclusion. It does not appear as a final summary inside the file. Instead, it reveals itself through the absence of new entries. No new directives, no new coordinated steps, no major legal actions that move the structure of the case forward. The file still exists. The records are still stored. The case name remains in official systems. But internally, the pace of movement slows, and then slows again. In administrative terms, this creates a very specific condition. The case is not closed, yet it is no longer actively driven by a structured, unified process. There is no decisive legal resolution, but there is also no sustained operational momentum. This shift rarely happens in a single moment. There is no date stamped on a page that announces the beginning of silence. Instead, it is the outcome of years of fragmentation, divided responsibility, and the gradual weakening of centralized control. Eventually, the system does not choose to end the case. It simply stops pushing it forward in a coordinated way. And in a criminal file, the absence of forward movement can last indefinitely. The Zodiac case did not disappear from records, but it gradually entered a state where most of its activity existed in memory, in archives, and in periodic reviews, rather than in a continuous investigative structure. This is not a dramatic collapse. It is an administrative fading. No clear breaking point, only a slow reduction of action, until what remains is a file that still exists, but no longer functions as an active engine of legal progress. And once a case reaches this level of administrative silence, bringing it back into a fully operational state becomes extraordinarily difficult. Because restarting it would require not just new evidence, but the reconstruction of a structure that has quietly dissolved over time. When a criminal case has remained in administrative silence for many years, the challenge is no longer just about finding new evidence. The challenge becomes structural. To restart a case in a meaningful legal way, the system needs more than renewed interest. It needs a file that can support coordinated legal action. Someone has to take responsibility for reviewing the entire record. Someone has to define a clear investigative direction. Someone has to ensure that future steps are built on a fully organized foundation. But when a case has passed through decades of fragmentation, those foundations are no longer stable. The file is not simply large. It is uneven. It contains layers of material collected under different structures, different priorities, and different standards of coordination. Before any new legal step can be taken, the system would first have to rebuild its own record. That means determining what has been done, what was never completed, and where continuity was lost between agencies and time periods. In other words, the system would have to investigate the file itself before it could effectively investigate the crime again. That kind of administrative reconstruction is enormous. It demands time, personnel, and institutional commitment without guaranteeing a clear result. And because of that, many long silent cases are never fully returned to active legal motion. They are not officially closed, but they also lack the structural stability needed to move forward. The Zodiac case reflects this condition. There has been public interest. There have been periodic reviews. There have been moments when the file is reopened for examination. But what remains absent is a fully unified administrative structure capable of supporting a decisive legal conclusion. Without that structure, the case does not end. It remains suspended. Not functioning as an active, continuously directed investigation, but not resolved through formal legal procedure either. That is why some cases endure for decades in a state of permanent uncertainty. They are not held open by mystery alone. They are held open by the difficulty of restoring order to a record that has long since lost its operational center. And that is how a criminal case can become not just unsolved, but structurally unable to reach a conclusion.